ultimately my sorrow and my pain and my joy still walk hand in hand. And honestly, I believe that's how it's going to be until I am in heaven myself, until I see Hunter again. And by faith, and because of what God has said, I believe that I will see Hunter. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind. God has said that he has made a way for me, made a way for us by faith in Christ, trusting in the finished work of Jesus, that we will spend eternity in heaven with God. And for me, I will spend eternity with my son, Hunter.
Welcome to the first official episode of the Light Your Heart with Hope podcast. I'm Erin, and I'm so thankful you're here. My hope and prayer is that through listening to today's episode, God would encourage you and do immeasurably more than all you can ask or imagine. Today's story is one that is very close to my heart. Getting to share my mom's testimony is truly an honor and a blessing. And even though I know her story, listening to her share felt like I was hearing it for the first time. And one of the incredible things about her story is the fact that pieces of it are also a part of my own story. Without her faith, without the pain and suffering she endured, I wouldn't know Jesus. I wouldn't be the person I am today. And I wouldn't have the hope that joy and pain can collide in the most beautiful way.
I'll start with a little bit of background. In 1991, I had just graduated from college, and that is when I met Jim. This was during the 4 Super Bowl years when Jim and his team, the Buffalo Bills, went to 4 consecutive Super Bowls. It was the height of his career, and that is when we met. We were dating for a while, and I eventually moved in with Jim. And soon after I moved in with Jim, we found out that I was pregnant with our first child, Aaron. I was afraid. I had never been a parent. I didn't know what to expect, what it was like to be a mom, and all the sort of things you go through as a first-time parent. Aaron was born in May 1995. And she kind of had a little bit of colic, but other than that, she was a very healthy baby. Jim and I got married in 1996, and it was actually on our honeymoon that our second child was conceived. So let me just give you a little more background. Jim comes from a family of 6 boys. So as you can imagine, he wanted to have a son. Jim wanted to do all the things that fathers and sons do, hunting, fishing. This would be the protege son that would more than likely play football and do all the things that Jim was raised to do. So Jim wanted a boy. There was one doctor's appointment that I went to, and Jim was unable to go. And during that appointment, we did an ultrasound, and my doctor asked me if I wanted to know the sex. So I found out that we were having a boy. So I kept that secret until February 14th, 1997, which is Valentine's Day, and Jim's birthday. My water broke. I had Hunter, and Jim was so excited. He couldn't believe that he finally had a son. Hunter was perfect. He was perfect. My pregnancy, literally, I've had 3 pregnancies. We have 3 children. Out of all of my pregnancy with Hunter was the smoothest and best pregnancy I had. He passed all of his newborn screening tests with flying colors. He was perfect. And in my mind, I felt like I was living the perfect scenario. Jim had just retired from football. We had a daughter who was almost 2, and now we had a son. I couldn't have written the story any better. Soon after we brought Hunter home, however, he became very irritable. And I thought, okay, well, this is probably similar to colic because Aaron had colic. And so I figured, well, I'll call the pediatrician, see what they say. And I did that. And they said, well, why don't you stop nursing and we'll start some formulas, we'll try different kinds to see how that goes. And that's what we did. Unfortunately, Hunter continued to be very irritable. He was crying most of the day if he wasn't sleeping, which he didn't sleep very much at all as well. And he just seemed uncomfortable and like he was in some sort of pain. And so, of course, I'm reaching out to the pediatrician. What should I do? He doesn't even seem to be able to drink any of this formula. And that's exactly what the problem was, is that he really was not, he was losing his ability to suck, but I didn't realize that. I was trying to help him by holding his face and all those sort of things. You do what you do as a mom, you do whatever you possibly can to help your child. And in addition to his, irritability and not really being able to take down formula, we had a nephew that was born 11 days before Hunter. So we were kind of comparing notes, so to speak, with Zach. And Zach was reaching milestones and Hunter was not. Hunter wasn't holding his head up. He didn't smile but once, a very teeny tiny smile, which we caught on camera. Thank God, because that's the only picture we have of Hunter, because that was the only smile he ever shared with us. And so, we were comparing notes and wondering, okay, something's not right. And we just kept going back and forth with the pediatrician and we weren't getting any answers. And Hunter continued to get worse. And then we had a 3-month well visit. And most of you know, if you're a parent listening to this, you know what a 3-month well visit is. You go in, they weigh your child, they give your child shots and do all the measurements and all of that to see if they're reaching milestones. As Hunter was laying on the table and she was doing an examination, she turned around, and I'll obviously never forget this moment, and looked at us and said, I think Hunter is showing signs of cerebral palsy. We just looked at each other like, what do you mean cerebral palsy? We were shocked. And I remember getting in the car and sitting in the back seat with Hunter. He was crying his eyes out. I was crying. Jim didn't know what to do. He had to drive. We got home. I remember talking to my parents about it, and we went into action mode. What can we do? How can we help Hunter? What are we going to do? And so we started physical therapy, occupational therapy. I mean, he's literally 3 months old. For about a month, really, we were going down the cerebral palsy road. We're like, okay, we can do this. And Hunter can start to use different parts of his brain. And you can actually be a very, highly functioning person with cerebral palsy. So we had hope and we were inundated with information. And we, like I said, had so much hope that we knew that we could do something and that Hunter would be okay. But yet Hunter continued to get worse. He was crying all the time. And so we would think of ways like, okay, how can we help him? And we just started doing things. We literally put him in a car seat and put it on the dryer because the vibration seemed to help him. And we were just getting to our wits' end, just trying to figure out ways in which to console him, to help him to feel better. He wasn't eating. We did a swallow study. We did all sorts of different studies. I remember seeing an ENT and just a whole barrage of tests. And eventually someone suggested that we see a neurologist. And so we did. So I was just thinking, okay, this is one of those other doctors we need to check off the list to help us with Hunter. And when we went in to see the neurologist, her name is Dr. Duffner, and she told us, she says, I'm going to test your son for a family of diseases called leukodystrophies. I'll never forget that day too, because Hunter, again, was inconsolable. He was crying and did not stop crying the entire time that we were at the doctor's appointment. She took blood. She didn't do anything other than just examine Hunter. And we went home. And I instinctively looked up the word leukodystrophies. And at that time on the internet, there was not that much information. Everything that I found was a nightmare, literally a nightmare, a parent's worst nightmare. Every leukodystrophy that I found information on was genetic, which I thought to myself, genetic, well, that means that, Jim and I would have to carry a gene to cause this horrific disease that they were explaining on the internet, right? And I was like, well, that can't be the case because we come from healthy families. Jim and I have no history of any sort of issues on either sides of our families. So we were like, okay, I'm in my mind, I'm like, well, this can't be right then. And he's not going to have a leukodystrophy. However, about a week after our appointment with Dr. Duffner, we got a phone call from her. She started explaining some things to me. She's like, I'd really like for you and Jim to come in so I can talk to you about the results of his Hunter's blood work. It was a beautiful day, actually, in June. We walked into Dr. Duffner's office and we sat down at a table in her office. And I remember everything about the room. I remember that there was books everywhere, as if we were in a library, really. And it was a kind of a musty smell. And I remember exactly where I sat and who sat next to me, because that was the day that everything in my life fell apart. The day that Dr. Duffner looked at Jim and I from across a table and said, your son Hunter has been diagnosed with Krabbe leukodystrophy. There's no cure. There's no treatment, and he will probably not live to see his second birthday. Wait a minute. This is Jim Kelly's son. Jim Kelly, the NFL quarterback, the one who took his team to 4 Super Bowls. He's famous. He knows people. We have money. In my mind, like, I'm thinking about all of the worldly things that we have because we had those things. And yet none of those things was going to save or help Hunter. There was no cure. There was no treatment. I said, isn't there anyone was doing anything for Krabbe disease? And the answer was no. I was shocked. I was devastated. I couldn't turn to Jim because I knew he was devastated, but at the same time, I couldn't even handle his pain. So I was a complete wreck. And I remember just sitting in the car on the way home and looking out the window and looking at all these cars going by, and that everyone else was going about their day as if it was just a normal, beautiful, sunny day in Buffalo. And my whole life was ruined and wrecked and crushed and broken. And I don't remember Jim and I really having a conversation on the way home. He was not going to be the superhero. He was not going to be the quarterback in this situation. Like, he wasn't going to save the day. There was nothing we could do, literally nothing we could do. And I remember going home and sitting on the couch and holding Hunter. And I just was holding him crying. And then Erin came over and sat next to me on the couch. And she just kept saying, Mommy, everything's going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay, Mommy. It's okay, Mommy. Everything's going to be okay. Here she is, this little 2-year-old trying to console me. And she has no idea. She has no idea what's coming and what news we were just given. And so I was crushed also for her. Just her innocence and the fact that she had no idea what was going to happen, because ultimately none of us knew what was going to happen. And so we were given this diagnosis. We were completely devastated, but it really devastated my marriage. Jim and I dealt with it very differently. He went to work at NBC and then he was working at ESPN. He was gone a lot. So his way of dealing with it, which I didn't know at the time, and I do now, obviously, was to run from the situation because he couldn't fix it. And my response to the diagnosis was to be consumed with Hunter's care and to be there every moment. I mean, I remember that everything that I thought that mattered up to that point, it didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered but being there for Hunter and Erin, and doing everything I possibly could as his mom to take care of him. There's no cure. There's no treatment. Well, what do you do? Well, right away, he got a feeding tube so that he could eat, because we're going to take advantage of every single thing available to us on this earth to help take care of Hunter. So we got the feeding tube. We got, suction machines because Hunter couldn't swallow. Eventually, because he had had pneumonia so many times, because he was aspirating into his lungs, he was on oxygen. By the time he was 8 months old, he was on oxygen then for the rest of his life. And in the midst of all this, We are figuring this all out, which you never really figure out. You just start to live one moment at a time, literally, because you don't know what to do and you're learning as you go. And there is no cure again and no treatment. So we don't even have a manual to go by. We're just going based on what Hunter is going through and based on his symptoms. And we're seeking help from, our neurologist and other doctors. So in the midst of everything that was going on with Hunter and taking care of him the best that we knew how, and we started to build Team Hunter, which consisted of physical therapy, occupational therapy, and all of those interventions we implemented for Hunter's life. And in the midst of all of this, I am so brokenhearted, broken as a person, because all of the things that I had put my hope in up to that very moment were empty. None of those things, Jim's name, his celebrity status, our wealth, none of those earthly things was going to save Hunter. None of those things were going to help him. Where do you go? If there's nothing on earth that's going to help you, that's going to be the answer for Hunter, well, you have to go beyond earth. And so that's what I did. I started to seek after the things of God. I wanted to know God for selfish reasons. I wanted to know God because if Hunter is going to heaven, because I didn't know when that day was going to be, I didn't know it could be the next day or the next day. So I was so consumed with taking care of Hunter and being with him because I never knew when that day would come, because we were told that he wouldn't live past his second birthday. So every day was a gift with Hunter. And yet for the first year and a half of Hunter's life, we treated him like he was dying because that's what we were told. That's all we knew. It wasn't until God intervened into our story that we actually started to treat Hunter like he was living. So here I am, I'm seeking after the things of God because I want to know about heaven. I want to know how to get there. If Hunter is going to heaven, I am going to heaven. Who is this God? I knew about the things of God. I was in church growing up. I saw the cross. I saw Jesus on it, but I did not have a relationship with God. I didn't care about the things of God. God was not anywhere on my radar screen until the things of this earth that I had put my hope and trust in had failed. I turned to God as a result of Hunter's suffering, as a result of watching him struggle every day. I turned to this God who I certainly did not know, but that I wanted to know with all my heart because I was very desperate. I was desperate for hope. I was desperate for help. I was desperate for heaven. I needed guidance. I needed what I could not get from this world. And so I started to seek after the things of God. And there were people in our lives that were very instrumental during that very, very dark season, during that season of being heartbroken and scared and mad and fearful and anxious and worried and all of those emotions. My Uncle Mark, I'll never forget, he would come over and he would bring his Bible and he would bring, actually, it was more like a bag or briefcase filled with all this Jesus stuff, a Bible, concordance, But what I remember most about my Uncle Mark was joy. He had such incredible joy, and I needed that joy. I needed what he had. I didn't understand why God would allow a child to suffer. There were so many questions that I had, but in the midst of it all, God began to reveal himself to me, even through the book of Job, which is one of my favorite books in the Bible. I took my suffering to God in the midst of this, and I also took Hunter's suffering. And what I realized was that it was ultimately God's only son, me taking the suffering of my one and only son and putting that in the hands of the God who gave his one and only son. That I had a place to go with Hunter's suffering. I had a place to go with my suffering because Jesus had suffered on my behalf. And so I started to learn and I started to grow in my faith. And part of that growth and part of getting to know God early on in my walk with him was, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, that a year and a half into Hunter's life, we started to treat Hunter like he was living instead of dying. And how do we do that? Well, Hunter got a room in the house. And we started to treat Hunter like he was living. We started to do things with Hunter. He went snowmobiling. He went to the zoo. My mom took him to the meat department in the grocery store. Why? I do not know. My mom made sure he got a library card. We started to do all these incredible things. Hunter went fishing. And the thing about this is that instead of treating him like he was dying, we were treating him like he was living. And we began to live. We were all needing the life that only God could give us through Christ. And so we all started living. There was so much joy. It was bubbling over, and people would come thinking, oh, it's going to be sad and somber. But instead, they got something very different. They got the life and the joy of God. They got hope. And that's what life was like with Hunter. And we were living it one day at a time, one prayer at a time, all in God's perfect timing. And then eventually Cameron came. I remember being pregnant with Cameron. And obviously with every child that we have, there is a percentage chance that child might have Krabbe disease. And so I knew that. I remember having so much peace though, in the midst of that pregnancy, because the hope of Christ dwelled in me at that time. And I knew that no matter what the outcome, whether she had Krabbe or whether she was a carrier or whether she was not a carrier, that God was going to be with us in the midst of it. And eventually we did find out that Cameron was just a carrier. But here we are, we have these 3 children and we are living life. And it is so filled with love and joy and purpose and laughter. And we started a Christian rock band in the house called the Hopesters. He had a best friend, Robert, who was Hunter's physical therapist, Elizabeth's son, who was the same age as Hunter. And Robert and Hunter's relationship, I could literally talk to you about for hours. It was the most beautiful and incredible thing I've ever witnessed. Robert never looked at Hunter as though he had a disease. He looked at him as a boy, a fun friend to be around. They played dinosaurs. They did rescue heroes. I mean, just watching them enjoy each other's company was one of the greatest gifts we received as a result of their friendship and of Hunter's life. Hunter's suffering did not cease. He continued to suffer and the disease continued to progress. We did not see the disease anymore. And at one point in time, I will never forget, my mom and I discussed getting Hunter tested again for Krabbe leukodystrophy because we just thought he's going to be exactly how he is and he's going to be here forever. And this is amazing. And he's going to continue to live because he did. He lived past his 2-year-old birthday. He lived to be 3. He lived to be 4. He lived to be 5. He lived to be 6. He lived to be 7. He was surpassing any limitations that doctors or statistics had put on his life. Like we just were like, oh my goodness, maybe he doesn't have Krabbe disease anymore. And our lives were so filled with life and joy that we forgot about the disease, although we still had to address the symptoms. We still had to address all the suffering that Hunter continued to go through. And I just want to also add that his personality, Hunter had an incredible personality. He was funny. He was even a stinker at some times. With his help, we learned how to communicate with him. He would blink once for yes, 3 times for I love you, and he would not blink for no. His teachers believed he was fully cognitive. Everyone that took care of him believed he was fully cognitive. So he was doing math problems. I mean, that sounds crazy. Well, how can someone who cannot speak, how can someone who's never communicated in the way we understand communication communicate? Well, he did. He taught us how to do that. And everyone knew he understood. Hunter taught us how to be patient, how to be thankful. I mean, we were thankful for every breath that we were given and every moment that God gave us with Hunter and together, every moment that God gave us together as a family of 5. We were taught patience and perseverance. Oh my goodness. I have never witnessed someone persevere like Hunter persevered. He wanted to live and we wanted him to live, and we all wanted to live life on purpose. And sometimes that purpose was just playing rescue heroes or watching Little Bear or watching Franklin or going outside and looking at the leaves outside during the fall, or, we realized that there was purpose in every moment, and not that we had to search for some kind of purpose, that there was already purpose in every moment. So we were living. And then 2005, August, it was a beautiful summer day. I was actually at home. And so Hunter was at my mom's and my dad's, and they have a pool, and Hunter loved water. That's another thing about Hunter's life. He loved being in the water, but it was a beautiful summer day. And it was very early in the morning. I can't remember exactly what time it was, but we got a phone call at the house, and it was my dad, and he was quite frantic. Jim came running into the room and he said, "Your dad's on the phone. Something's going on with Hunter." And I got on the phone, and my dad said, "Hunter, stop breathing." And in the back of my mind, I was like, well, he's going to be fine. He's going to be fine. Well, where is he and what's going on? And he said, well, they took him by ambulance to Warsaw Hospital, and Warsaw Hospital is out where my mom and dad live. They live about 45 minutes from us. And so immediately I'm like, well, he has to go to Children's Hospital, because Hunter had been at the hospital often. People knew Hunter at Children's Hospital, and we had faith in the people and the nurses and the doctors. I mean, they're just familiar with Hunter's life. And so that was one of the last things I said. And I said, "I'm coming right now." And that was like the last thing that Jim heard me say was, he needs to go to Children's Hospital. I rushed and got in the car, and I started heading towards Warsaw. It was very, very early in the morning. And so not many cars were on the road. In fact, I feel like I was the only car on the road, and I was fine. I was going really fast. And I kept saying, "No, no, please God, no, no." And I was bawling and screaming in the car, "No, no, no, God, no, God." For whatever reason, I knew something was wrong, and I knew something wasn't the usual, because when I say the usual, it means Hunter has been to the hospital. We have been in emergency situations in the past, and he's always pulled through. And although I thought he would do the same this time, there was something very different about what had happened. What had happened was he stopped breathing, and he's never really stopped breathing ever. And that EMTs had to rush him to the nearest hospital. And that was really all I knew. So in the back of my mind, I was like hopeful everything was going to be okay. But also I was just with Hunter at my mom and dad's house the night before. So it was midnight when I left the house. And then my dad called at like 4 or 5 in the morning it was. And when I left Hunter at midnight, he looked angelic. He was radiant. He didn't have any sounds at all in his lungs. He looked beautiful, and he was sleeping, and I kissed him goodnight. And I said, "I'll see you tomorrow." So when I left, I felt that everything was fine. So I was very alarmed, obviously, when my dad called and said that they took him to Warsaw Hospital. So I'm flying there, and I'm saying, "No, God, no, no, God, no." And here Jim is, and I don't find this out till later. Jim, all he heard me say was, "You have to take him to Children's Hospital." So he heads down to Children's Hospital in Buffalo, and he gets to the hospital, and he's like, "Where's my son Hunter?" He goes to the emergency room, and they're like, "We're sorry, Mr. Kelly, he's not here." He's like, "What do you mean he's not here?" He was taken here by an ambulance. And he started to, share the story of what happened. And somehow, some way, they found out where Hunter was, that he was actually in Warsaw Hospital. So when I got to the hospital, my dad, I'll never forget this too. He was at the end of the road into the hospital, waving me down. His hands were up in the air, waving me down so I would know where to go. And I could just tell, I could tell by the look on his face that something was horribly wrong. So I pulled up and I parked the car. And then the next person I remember seeing, because a lot of this, I don't remember everything. And maybe that's just God's way of protecting me from the pain of it all. But the next person I remember seeing was my mom. And she looked like she had been crying and the tears were still in her eyes. And then she just ushered me into where Hunter was. And then the next person I saw was Hunter. And he was surrounded by all these doctors and nurses. And I got my face right up next to his face. And I said, Mommy's here. And I just knew that he wasn't there. Everything about Hunter was not there anymore. I wanted to see Hunter's lung exam. I wanted to see what his lungs look like, because in my mind, I'm like, it's his lungs and he just needs to be put on a respirator, but he already was on a respirator, which I didn't even realize because I was so overcome by what was happening, because there was so much action and people were moving and they were doing the CPR. They didn't stop doing the CPR. And so I remember I walked out of the room with the head of the emergency room and he took me over to look at Hunter's chest x-ray, and it was the best I'd ever seen it ever. So it wasn't his lungs. And I said to the doctor, I said, is there anything else you can do? Because in my mind, I didn't know. Maybe there was another machine. Maybe there was another something that Hunter could go on that could give him what he needed to have in order to keep living. And I'll never forget, the emergency doctor looked at me and he's like, we've done everything that we can do. And we love Hunter too. And I just remember losing it and then going back into the room. And Jim still wasn't there at this point in time because Children's Hospital is over an hour away from Warsaw Hospital. And he had gone to Children's because that's what he heard me say to my dad. And so here he is at the wrong hospital heading to Warsaw. And here I am. I go back into the room and I just knew. And so I told the people, I told all the nurses, I just looked at them and I told them to stop. And then they stopped and everything was quiet. It was the worst sound ever because there was no noise, there was no machines, there was no anything. And then all I remember, in a rush, Jim came in and I left. I walked out of the room and then I was with my mom. And I just remember that we had to leave the hospital without Hunter. And then I had to go home. And Aaron was 10 at the time and Cameron was 6. And my mom drove home with me and Jim in the car. And I don't remember a lot of what we said other than 2 things. One was it was Robert's birthday. So Hunter went to heaven on his best friend's birthday. He was born on his dad's birthday and he went to heaven on his best friend's birthday. And then I don't think we said very much on the way home, but I knew that we were going to have to tell Aaron and Cameron. And I remember walking through the front door and Erin, the first she saw us, and the first thing she said was, "Where's Hunter?" Because all of us were there at the same time, and that was never happened. I mean, we wouldn't all be there. I mean, if he was sick, if he was in the hospital, one of us would always be with Hunter. He would never be left alone. And then we went into Hunter's room in the back of the house. And we told them, and I don't remember all the words. I just remember telling the girls that Hunter had gone to heaven. And I remember them crying. And my mom and Jim were both there. You don't ever imagine as a parent that you will bury a child. You don't ever imagine as a parent that a child will die. It's just not something that is you imagine to be part of your life. We did think Hunter would keep living. Hunter gave us so much joy, and we had such a full life when he was here on earth with us. And I think ultimately that's one of the things I miss the most, is that no matter what the circumstances were, no matter what was going on in Hunter's life, even if he was going through a season of suffering, even if, something was wrong, and which everything was wrong, right? Like he still had Krabbe and it was still progressing, but there was so much joy. I miss that joy. Not that I don't experience it now, I do, but ultimately my sorrow and my pain and my joy still walk hand in hand. And honestly, I believe that's how it's going to be until I am in heaven myself, until I see Hunter again. And by faith, and because of what God has said, I believe that I will see Hunter. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind. God has said that he has made a way for me, made a way for us by faith in Christ, trusting in the finished work of Jesus, that we will spend eternity in heaven with God. And for me, I will spend eternity with my son, Hunter. Of course, he never spoke a word here. And his first word literally was in heaven. I can only imagine. And when I even start to try to wrap my head and my heart around what that would be like, or what that word was, I'm overcome with emotion, both joy and sorrow in many ways. Joy because he's speaking, he's free, he's healthy, he's whole, he is where everything is perfect, where there is no sorrow, no more tears, only joy and life. And he is where there is fullness of life. And he's with Jesus, the greater gift. And so what do I do now? How do you live with the pain? Well, for me, I do it one day at a time, one prayer at a time. And I trust God. Does that mean that it has been easy? Does that mean that I have been just, the seasons of grief and the loss of a child has been an easy road? Absolutely not. 8 months after Hunter went to heaven, I fell into a very dark depression. I suffered from anxiety. I was started having panic attacks, and it was a very, very dark season for me. And I'll tell you, without knowing what I know about God and putting my very fragile faith in his hands and trusting in his faithfulness, I can tell you honestly that I don't know how I survived. Just like I have survived the heartbreak and the grief of what we have experienced through the loss of Hunter because of God's faithfulness. Because my faith is all over the place. I mean, some days I am rock solid, and then some days I am not. I am on the floor begging God for more faith. It is because of faithfulness and the love and the provision of God that I am who I am today, and that I am even able to share what I share. After Hunter went to heaven, you think, okay, all the shoes dropped. We've experienced the greatest loss imaginable. And, we survived. We're trusting in God. We're walking by faith. And then Jim gets diagnosed with oral cancer, not once, but 3 times. And then my daughter, Erin, goes through her own season of grief. It's overwhelming. But at the end of the day, the answer and the hope in the midst of all of these circumstances that we've been given in life is the same answer. It's the same answer that was given to me in that moment when we were given the diagnosis for Hunter. It's the same rescue plan. It's Jesus. So the same God who is there for us in the midst of our greatest heartbreak is the same God that is with me in this moment today. And without him, I do not know. I can't even imagine what my life would be like. But with him, I am able to live with joy, to still walk through dark seasons, but yet to have the hope that knows beyond a shadow of a doubt that I am going to pull through, that I am going to come out of this place because God is victorious. I have everything I need for life and godliness through him. So on the days when I'm having a hard time, I'm having a difficult day. I mean, every day I think about Hunter. There's not a day that goes by that I don't. But some days are harder than others. And on those days, I cry. I feel what I need to feel. I feel the grief. I feel the sorrow. And then I trust God with all of that. I surrender my life to him, and I trust that he will see me through that day.
For as long as I can remember, my joy and pain have always walked hand in hand. And honestly, there were moments where I believed that the two could never exist in the same breath. And yet I've seen them come alive in the most beautiful way. And the most significant way is through my mom's testimony and our family's story. I've witnessed the pain of watching my brother suffer, and yet the joy of spending precious moments with him for the first 10 years of my life. I've lived through the pain of brokenness and the joy when I finally saw a breakthrough. The pain of heartbreak, but the joy that comes in healing. I'm so thankful that I've been able to share my mom's story with you all. God is still working in a mighty way, working all things together for good. If you want to learn more about my mom's story, you can look at the show notes. Also, you can find access to the incredible books that dive deeper into her story, discuss grief, loss, brokenness, but in the midst of it all, provide tremendous hope. On Monday, listen in for another amazing testimony of how, by the grace of God, our joy and pain can collide. Thank you so much for being here. I hope that my mom's story and the legacy of my brother Hunter's life encourage you to share your own story. You matter, your life matters, and your story can make an impact that matters for eternity. Make a difference today for someone who is fighting for their tomorrow.